is Justin Fox, and I am a senior health physicist out of the Pantex plant. And we are here today to make one of the best of the food groups, which is Mexican food. So today we're going to be making a tortilla. Everybody should have the recipe in their lesson plan. This is a King Arthur recipe. So to start, we're going to go with flour. And one important thing to remember when you're baking is that volume and density are not the same thing. So really important is to weigh these out if the recipe is in gram weight. So the recipe you have is actually per cup. But as an example, we'll take this 1 cup of flour. So this cup is exactly 300 grams. Even at the top. Now we'll go ahead and grab a 2nd cup of flour. Also relatively even at the top for a difference of 9 grams. Now it's not going to make a huge difference in the tortilla, but if you're baking at home, if you're baking a cake, if you're doing anything that requires a little more accuracy, then you're going to really want to pay attention to the gram weight that you're supposed to use in your recipe. So volume is great, and that's the way a lot of recipes are. A lot of British recipes are actually in gram weight. So look for those alternatives when you're cooking. So here, let's see, this will be 2.5 cups of flour. Next, we're going to go on to baking powder, not to be confused with baking soda. It will not taste the same. So we have 1 teaspoon of baking powder. And then we go on to salt. Now the salt we're using here is table salt. And as mentioned in the lesson plan, there are going to be different saltiness levels to different types of salt. Now what you coat your steak in, coming up here in a little bit, is going to be kosher salt. Now this iodized table salt has a higher level of sodium chloride. And what that means is it's a saltier salt per the amount of salt you add to the recipe. If you were to go and coat your steak with this table salt, you're going to end up with an incredibly salty steak. Vice versa, if you were to add kosher salt to this recipe, it's not going to be as salty as you want it. So it's important that you use the right type of salt for the recipe. Now that we have all the dry ingredients together, you're going to go ahead and whisk it all. And the goal there is just get uniform distribution of all the ingredients. Only takes a couple seconds. All right, so that should probably be about uniform now. Now the type of fat that we've chosen here today is bacon fat, and that's half because I wanted to eat bacon while we were making these, and half because bacon fat tends to add the best flavor. And a good way to modify the recipe is just change the type of bacon you get. If you want hickory smoked bacon, you get a different flavor to your tortillas than you would as a standard salted bacon. That ends up adding a lot of dynamic to this. Now, you saw the way it was added here. It's not exactly room temperature. So room temperature looks a little more like this. It's starting to get a little milky looking. And you can actually use it cold. I pretty frequently use it cold. And the reason behind that is as you mix this up, if you're using cold fat, as you fold it into the tortilla, you're going to get little chunks of fat here and there. And as those cook on the stove, those are going to evaporate and they create those nice bubbles in conjunction with the baking powder in the tortilla. So you end up with nice little fat pockets, and in addition to the fat that we've added, we're going to throw a little bit of butter in here. This isn't really measured. It's mostly just because salted Amish butter adds a really good texture and a really good crisp to the tortilla, whereas if you just add the fat, you don't get a little bit of the crispiness on it and a little bit of the extra salt. So you're going to mix this by hand. And a fun fact here, if you want to add a little bit of extra flavor, just don't wash your hands before you do this. And the goal is to have the fat get coated by the flour. Another thing that's mentioned in that lesson plan is the formation of gluten as you start to do this. And the gluten is a little frustrating when you're making tortillas because that's what makes the dough really stretchy. Now by mixing this fat in ahead of time and getting a good coat on the flour, it's going to help slow down the formation of gluten. Which is good because these are going to have to rest for a little bit before we roll them out. And during that time, if you haven't mixed this fat in ahead of time and you mix it in with the water, then you're going to get really strong gluten formation. And that makes it very difficult to roll these tortillas out. So right there, it's nice and chunky, making a surprisingly small amount of mess right now. So it should look about like that. All that fat's coated up. It's worked together pretty well. Now we're going to go ahead and add the water. So we're going to add just a little less than a cup of water. And it's always better to add a little bit and then add more if you need it. Now the recipe says go ahead and use a bakery mixer with this. I would say continue using your hands already dirty. It's a little more fun that way. Now tortilla dough is a little different than bread dough, so it's going to be a bit stickier. After you work in the flour enough, it'll start to fall off your fingers, so don't worry about that too much. And once it starts to get formed, you can knead it down with your knuckles. And again, it'll all eventually come off your hands. The other thing you want to make sure of before you start this is that you have a nice, clean, flat surface to roll these out on, because otherwise you're going to break somebody's tooth if you haven't cleaned all the dirt off your space. So now that we've made it into an actual lump of dough, we're going to take it out of the container, the bowl, and put it on the counter. Get the bowl out of the way, because now you're pretty much going to be able to work it with your hands. And tortilla dough is tricky again, so you don't want to overwork it, because if you overwork it, it's not going to puff up as much. Nice to get those layers in there, and you can see part of getting the fat in there too is the way that it layers out. Gets you all those nice layers in the tortilla that add all that good flavor into it. So we got a little bit of stray dough here. I'm going to go ahead and rather than add a little bit more water, I think I'm going to add a little bit more fat. And fold it in layers as it goes. After doing this for a little bit, you're going to find that the dough starts to smooth out some. It doesn't get nearly as flaky as it did when you started. So as you roll it over, this will eventually become a little bit smoother. Now, you can cut this to the way you see fit. I'm going to go ahead and throw it on here. Typically, this will make about 6 or 8 tortillas. So we're running about 500, 550. So these are going to run about 100 grams a piece per tortilla. All right, so now that that dough's worked together, it's not too worked up, still a little bit of chunk to it. We're going to go ahead and we're going to tear off right there, 104. So we'll go with 104. Work this down, your thumb to the top, kind of roll it under. Roll it and pinch, roll it and pinch. Flip it, make sure you got no air in it. And then what you're going to do is set this aside. You're going to end up with 2 rows. So it's going to be 2 rows of 3. And you're going to want to go ahead and take a wet paper towel, just damp, and lay them on top of this while we prep for the rest of the stuff. we're back, and as you can see, we have 5 very nice little rolled up tortillas ready to be rolled out. You might be wondering why there's 5. That is because I always have a test tortilla. Inevitably, I always mess up at least the first or second one. So we use the first or second ones to make sure the temperature on the skillet is correct. And the reason is if you cook them too quickly, then you end up with burned outside and raw inside. If you cook them too slow and you flip them before they've started to brown like this, what'll happen is you solidify the exterior of this tortilla, and it makes it much more difficult for those air pockets to form and spread and fluff the rest of the tortilla. So it's really important that before you jump into making all of these tortillas, you need to dial in your heat. Also, play around with the recipe. You know, nobody says it has to be a little half a teaspoon of salt or a teaspoon of salt or a quarter cup of fat. So absolutely go through and make it yours. If you think it needs more salt, add more salt. If you want more fat in it because it wasn't puffy enough or you want more baking powder, go ahead and add it as long as it's edible. Nobody can complain, they're eating for free. So it's really important to get these rolled out evenly, and this will take a large amount of time. I had a previous career making pizzas, so it comes a little more naturally. You want to get it even all the way around, probably about 1/8 of an inch thick. Again, this is all because you want to make sure that tortilla cooks in the right order, right? So if you make it a little too fat, what's going to happen is it's going to cook the outsides and get dark on the outside before it's even heated up the middle. Then you end up with a chewy tortilla, but it's chewy because you haven't cooked any of your dough. All right, so now that it's all rolled out, you can see that it's fairly even. If you've let this sit a little bit too long or the gluten has formed more, then what's going to happen is as you roll this out, it's going to shrink back down while you're trying to roll it out. And those will still taste good, it just takes a little bit longer to roll these out. So you peel it up. Now we're going to come over to your skillet. This is going to go right on your skillet. Little bit of a hiss. So right now we are using a non-stick pan. And we're using a non-stick pan just because between the steak and the tortillas, and we're going to be caramelizing different vegetables after this, it makes it a lot easier to clean up. Now typically you want to use something that has a thicker bottom. This is a conduction. It's built for a conduction oven, so it's got a very thick bottom. And that helps the heat distribute through the pan quite a bit better. What'll happen, especially on a gas cooktop, is if you have a pan that's thin, you're going to get real hot spots only in the place where the flame is interacting with that pan. So you'll get burn areas on your tortilla. And if you want to come in here, you see all these little bubbles that are forming. And again, that's a mixture of the fat and also the baking powder. So the more fluff you get, the more layers that form. The more layers you form, the greater the amount of flavor you're going to get out of your tortilla. And to give it a more traditional tortilla feel and look to it. My recommendations on these are either a cast iron or a copper pot. Makes it a lot easier to cook, a lot easier to brown, and it cooks evenly. If you want to double check to see what kind of burn pattern you have in your pan, go ahead and add some water to it and watch where that water starts to bubble. And if it starts bubbling in a circle only around the burner, then you know you have a really high transfer rate for heat right in that pan, right in that portion of the pan. So stuff that has a thicker bottom, you'll get a more uniform buildup of bubbles as it starts to boil. Now this is puffing up like a pillow. You want to let it sit for a little bit, because what happens is when you flip it over, you're going to have points in the tops of these bubbles, and those sections are what's going to interact on the bottom of the pan, and they're going to burn, or not burn, they're going to brown first. So we need to make sure that enough is cooked on the first side, because after you flip this, there's not going to be enough heat to cook through the whole tortilla, because that tortilla won't be touching enough of the surface area of the pan. So we're going to go ahead and flip, and you can see right there, nice and brown. You can go ahead and push it down a little bit too. And we'll let that sit for a little bit. Now you got to figure out if you want them chewy, if you want them a little crispy. If you leave it on here for a while, it kind of turns out like a bread. If you take it off a little bit early, let's see, a little bit browner than that, you're going to end up with a chewy taco. So we'll go ahead and pull this. This is going to be about the thickness that you want. You can see in a lot of places it's about a 1/4 inch thick even when I take it off the pan. So that's going to be your first taco, or tortilla. All right, now we're moving on to steak. So as you can see here, I cheated a little bit. I pre-cooked my steak. And as you can see, we have about a medium well on this steak. And the reason behind that, there's a couple of reasons. One, I don't want you guys to have to sit through 60 minutes of me cooking a steak. And the other is, for a medium steak, a lot of people don't like that texture. So to err on the side of caution, we've gone with a medium well. So jumping right to using the skillet. You want to have your skillet on high heat for this when you actually do the sear for the steak. In the directions that you have, it's going to tell you about 5 minutes on each side on high heat. So we're jumping right to high heat. We're going to do about a minute on each side. And that is to get the Maillard reaction going. And the Maillard reaction is a reaction with the proteins, the amino acids, and the reducing sugars in that steak. So that's what gives you that brown coat, either on your burger or your steak. And it has all that flavor. It's got the crusted salt in it. And it's got all of the flavors that that steak can produce. Next thing we're going to do is add butter. And you might be thinking, that's a lot of butter, but I guarantee you, there is no amount of butter that's too much to add to anything you're cooking. So now that the sear is done, we're going to take this off and we're going to take the butter and pour it over that. Now you don't want to add the butter when it's too hot. The reason behind that is the butter will burn very quickly, as you can see there. Now we're going to go ahead and add some veggies for caramelization. Taking it off this burner. So as you can see, the onions turn a little bit brown, building up a little bit of flavor. The onions take a little bit longer to reduce, so we put them on first. Again, you don't want them black. You just want this nice brown that's starting to develop. Oh, those are going. We're going to add a spoonful of jalapenos, depending on how hot you want it. And a little bit of garlic. Caramelization here is essentially the same as the Maillard reaction on the meat. The difference is caramelization takes place at a higher temperature, which is why we had the heat on the pan cranked up so high. That starts to brown all those sugars. Good, and I'll let that sit for a bit. All right, so that right there will be about good. Let's go ahead. I'm going to put most of it in here. And then I think I'm going to keep the rest on and let that cook and reduce a little bit. It's enough to fill one taco. And that can slow way down. All right, man, that's it for the veggies. All So we're at the end of the journey. Hopefully you have some palatable tacos. We're going to start with the tortilla. Then we're going to go to the meat. We're going to slice this up. All right. So that ended up staying medium well because of the quick sear. Now we have our caramelized vegetables. And those are going to go on top, and these are more to just accentuate the flavor of the salsa we're going to put on. And now you're going to top with your favorite shredded cheese. And serve with a side of your favorite salsa. And that is how you make a taco from scratch.